Breaking news doesn't always make history, but today it just might. In a region long gripped by the shadow of fear, a spark has been lit by the hands of its own children. Over 100 armed militants neutralized. Villages once silenced by terror now echo with the sound of life. The eastern heartland of Burkina Faso has erupted with the kind of victory no one, especially the international pundits, thought possible. And this wasn't delivered by foreign boots or borrowed drones. It was led by a young, determined captain whose name now pulses across the Sahel like a battle cry, Ibrahim Traore. Just months ago, only 40% of the country was under government control. Today it's 72% and counting. So why did progress bloom only after the French departed? Who benefits when Africa fights its own battles and wins? Is this a one-time miracle or the dawn of something irreversible? Stay with us. This is more than breaking news. It's the sound of a continent waking up. Subscribe now and stand tall with us, for this is the moment Africa Rising begins to roar. In the eastern region of Burkina Faso, where dust hangs heavy in the air, and families have for years whispered rather than sung, a different sound recently broke the silence. The thunder of armored vehicles, the roar of precision airstrikes, and, perhaps most crucially, the sighs of relief from villagers long held hostage by fear. The government of Burkina Faso, led by its increasingly resolute military, launched a campaign of such scale and accuracy that even the most seasoned observers of African security affairs were stunned. In a single coordinated offensive, the country's armed forces dismantled one of the most entrenched insurgent strongholds in the region, neutralizing over 100 militants, seizing caches of weapons, and arresting dozens of fighters who had previously moved through the bush with impunity. This was not a lucky break. It was a masterclass in planning. The operation combined intelligence-led targeting, carefully timed ground maneuvers, and the strategic use of aerial support. A trifecta rarely executed with such precision by regional forces acting independently. The offensive began just before dawn, when surveillance drones, operated by local intelligence units, confirmed the presence of several high-value targets congregating in an abandoned settlement near Compiègne province. Within hours, elite units from the National Armed Forces were deployed by land and air. They moved fast, they moved quietly, and most importantly, they moved together. By mid-morning, the stronghold had fallen. Among the captured were field commanders, logistics runners, and foreign-trained operatives believed to have links with transnational terror networks. Their weapons, a mix of Soviet-era rifles, handmade explosives, and modified armored pickups, now in the custody of the state. Their plans revealed and dismantled before execution. But numbers alone don't paint the full picture. What this victory represents, especially to the people who have lived under the thumb of terror for over a decade, is proof. Proof that the government can not only defend them, but liberate them. In regions where schools have been shuttered, markets looted, and fields burned, there is now a tangible breath of freedom in the air. For the small farming communities around Fadangurma and Diabo, this isn't just news, it's deliverance. Families who once sent their children to bed in underground shelters are now rebuilding homes with the help of local defense groups and military engineering units. Teachers are returning to classrooms that once echoed with gunfire. Traders are reopening stalls in markets that had long become ghost towns. More importantly, this victory speaks volumes about the transformation under the country's current leadership. When Ibrahim Traore took power, only 40% of Burkina Faso was considered to be under the effective control of the government. The rest was a patchwork of contested zones and lawless terrain ruled by insurgent factions. Today, the map looks very different. 72% of the territory is now reported to be secure and stabilized, a number verified by multiple national and regional monitoring groups. Let that sink in. In less than a year, more than a third of the nation's territory has been reclaimed, not with the help of foreign troops, not under the supervision of external advisors, but through a locally led, strategically sound, and fiercely executed campaign. This kind of momentum is rare, and it sends a message louder than any political speech. Burkina Faso is no longer waiting to be saved. it is saving itself. For those who have been following the region, the contrast is undeniable. At a time when international partners withdrew, doubted, or dismissed the country's capabilities, it doubled down on sovereignty. It retrained its forces. It restructured its command. It reimagined its battlefield, not just as a place of conflict, but as a theater for national rebirth. And while military experts debate logistics and geopolitics, one simple fact now echoes from the east to the west. The people believe again, not in miracles, but in the power of determination backed by strategy. It's in the voices of mothers singing to babies no longer jolted by distant gunshots, in the quiet confidence of farmers planting again without fear of landmines, in the eyes of young boys watching military convoys not with terror, but with pride. Burkina Faso has taken a bold step toward reclaiming its nation, not just from terrorists, but from the narrative that Africa cannot defend itself. But this victory is not just about numbers. It cracked open a truth many feared to say out loud. In every war, there comes a moment when the tide turns, not only on the battlefield, but deep within the hearts of a people. For Burkina Faso, that moment came not with a single shot, but with 1,000 quiet realizations. We are not powerless. We can win. The high point of this recent operation, what many are calling the Eastern Uprising, was not just the neutralization of more than 100 insurgents, but the symbolic reclamation of everyday life. After years of silence, the markets of Fadangorma hummed again with the sounds of negotiation and laughter. In the dusty courtyards of rural villages, elders gathered, not to plan evacuation routes, but to talk of harvests, weddings, and the return of grandchildren. Perhaps the most striking image came from a small school in Compiègne. The building, abandoned for nearly 2 years, had become a hideout for armed rebels. After the offensive, community members and soldiers joined hands to repaint its cracked walls and scrub bloodstains from the floors. A week later, children arrived wearing freshly washed uniforms, some too big, some too small, but all filled with hope. One teacher who had fled to Ouagadougou returned with only one suitcase and tears in his eyes. "I left with fear in my bones. I've come back with faith in my country." This wasn't just a military win. It was a moral revival. Across the nation, the atmosphere shifted. Radio hosts spoke of it with trembling voices. Local griots and praise singers began weaving the victory into folk songs. Social media lit up with hashtags calling it the rebirth of the East. And at the center of it all stood a figure who had once been dismissed as too young, too inexperienced, too radical, Captain Ibrahim Traore. Unlike many of his predecessors who led from air-conditioned offices behind concrete walls, Traore has insisted on a different model. His visits to liberated zones aren't announced weeks in advance. They happen quietly, almost stealthily. One day, villagers simply look up and see him, standing beside exhausted soldiers, sharing water with children, listening more than he speaks. It's this presence, this raw commitment, that has turned him from a political figure into a symbol. In one widely shared video clip, a grandmother clutches his uniform and says, "You walk like my own son, but you lead like the lion we prayed for." Under his leadership, the army has adopted a new tone, not just tactical, but emotional. Soldiers speak of fighting for faces, not just for flags. They describe missions not as deployments, but as returns, to homes they had once abandoned, to soil they had once feared to touch. But not everyone is cheering. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, some foreign analysts are visibly unsettled. Editorials from Paris, Berlin, and Washington have questioned the sustainability of the military's gains. They raise concerns about human rights, long-term governance, and whether popular militarism could spiral into authoritarianism. These concerns, while not baseless, often carry an unmistakable subtext. How dare they succeed without us? For decades, the Sahel was treated as a dependent zone, a theater where outside powers staged their interventions, humanitarian gestures, and geopolitical rivalries. The rise of a self-reliant military campaign, one that expels foreign bases and still produces results, has disrupted that script. And disruption breeds discomfort. Still, the people on the ground are less interested in headlines abroad than in the sound of birdsong returning to the forest. For them, victory is not an academic concept. It is being able to send a daughter to fetch water without clutching one's chest in fear. It is sleeping through the night. It is seeing a green shoot emerge from burnt land. Traore, for his part, has not ignored the complexities. In a national address broadcast days after the victory, he struck a tone both resolute and reflective. This fight was never about revenge. It is about reclamation. We are not chasing ghosts. We are retrieving our children, our rivers, our soul. And the world, whether ready or not, is beginning to take notice. International observers from neighboring Mali and Niger have quietly sent representatives to study the Burkina Faso model. Civilian defense networks in Chad and Benin are now calling for similar structural reforms. Even parts of the African Union, once cautious in tone, are beginning to murmur about a new Sahel paradigm, led by Africans, for Africans, on African terms. Still, the road ahead is steep. Militants, though wounded, are not eradicated. Retaliation is expected. The Northeast remains volatile. And there are whispers of sleeper cells attempting to regroup along the southern borders. But for the first time in years, the government isn't reacting to fire. It is setting the agenda. And through all of this, something even more potent than military strength has begun to blossom. Unity. Across ethnic lines, across generational divides, the nation is rallying, not behind a party, but behind the principle that sovereignty is not negotiable. And yet, while the nation celebrates, some voices abroad begin to stir uneasily. Victory on the battlefield may be measured in bodies and borders. But the true cost and value of war is always paid in civilian lives. In the weeks following the Eastern Campaign's success, a new kind of silence settled over the region. Not the silence of fear, but the absence of gunfire. In provinces like Tapoa and Gorma, where nightfall once meant hiding indoors and praying for dawn, communities are cautiously stepping out again. The daily routines of life, long interrupted, are now being rethreaded like pieces of torn cloth stitched with trembling fingers. One of the most immediate effects was economic. Dozens of markets, once deserted and overrun by extortionist networks, have reopened with government security patrols in place. Traders speak of a sudden surge in activity, salt, grain, fabrics, radios, all moving again. Mobile network providers, once shut down to block insurgent coordination, have begun restoring signal, reconnecting families and allowing local businesses to reemerge online. In the village of Logabu, where insurgents had burned down 2 of the only 3 health posts, international aid groups are now collaborating with local military engineers to rebuild infrastructure. Temporary clinics have sprung up. The injured are being treated not as collateral damage, but as the sacred core of national healing. And then there is the classroom. UNESCO reports that over 1,000 schools across Burkina Faso were closed due to insecurity in the past 3 years. But following the military's advance, the Ministry of Education announced an ambitious Reopen and Reclaim initiative. The goal to have at least 500 schools functioning again in secure regions by the next academic quarter. That means not only rebuilding structures, but retraining teachers, counseling students, and reestablishing trust. In this transformation, Captain Traore's government has adopted a tone that is both assertive and inclusive. His recent address to the National Assembly called for dignity-led development, a plan that places local communities at the center of decision-making and shifts away from donor-driven models. His statement was blunt. We will not rebuild under foreign terms what we bled to defend by our own hands. It is this attitude, at once defiant and visionary, that has begun to reshape the political fabric of the country. Where older regimes often leaned heavily on external legitimacy, visits from foreign dignitaries, donor conferences, military assistance, this administration is drawing its strength from domestic alignment. Local leaders, traditional chiefs, youth groups, and women's associations have all been brought into the national recovery conversation. There's also a noticeable uptick in civic participation. Town hall meetings, radio call-ins, and even community forums in newly liberated zones are seeing record engagement. People who once feared to speak are now demanding investment, inclusion, and transparency. The trauma of war has not silenced them. It has sharpened their expectations. Of course, such rapid transformation is not without challenges. Reports have emerged of resource bottlenecks, mismanagement of aid in certain departments, and allegations of abuse by local defense volunteers. Traore's administration has responded swiftly, launching investigations, arresting offenders, and publicly reinforcing the importance of discipline and dignity in governance. But critics remain. Some warn that centralizing too much authority in the hands of the military risks setting dangerous precedents. Others point to the fragility of gains made in a country still facing poverty, unemployment, and the climate pressures that fuel migration and desperation. Still, the mood within the country is clear. People feel seen. For generations, Burkina Faso, like so much of the continent, has been told to wait for development, for stability, for permission to act. Now that narrative is shifting. The people are no longer waiting. They are asking harder questions of their leaders and of themselves. And this shift is reflected in Burkina Faso's international posture as well. Foreign embassies, once flush with influence, are recalibrating. Development partners are now being asked to work with, not over, local authorities. Even multilateral institutions have been advised that all new agreements must align with national security and sovereignty priorities. This rebalancing of power has made some observers uneasy, but to many Africans watching across the continent, it is long overdue. One young activist in Ouagadougou put it plainly, "They call us poor, they call us unstable, but when we fight for ourselves, they call us dangerous. What do they want?" This isn't just a military campaign, it's a cultural reckoning, a redefining of what it means to be a modern African state, sovereign, self-reliant, and unapologetic. And perhaps this is the most radical change of all, not the guns, not the maps, but the minds of a people waking up to their own power. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. But what does the world think when an African nation wins without asking permission? When the dust settled in eastern Burkina Faso and the scale of the government's military triumph became clear, the international response was far more reserved than celebratory. In capitals from Paris to Brussels, policy analysts began crafting cautious statements, praising stability while expressing concern over long-term governance frameworks. But beneath the diplomatic language, one sentiment rang loud: surprise. Surprise that a state once labeled fragile had executed a large-scale counterterrorism operation with no foreign boots on the ground. Surprise that a country which had expelled French forces less than a year earlier was now reclaiming territory faster than it ever did under international military support. France, once the dominant external power in Burkina Faso and across much of West Africa, was notably muted. State media briefly acknowledged the operation, but quickly shifted focus to potential human rights issues, citing unverified reports. Critics in the region responded with pointed questions. Where was this concern when terrorists were controlling 60% of our land? Indeed, the contrast between past dependence and current independence could not be more stark. Under French military presence, insurgent groups had not only survived, but thrived. Now, with local command in charge, those groups are being pushed back. In Washington, the reaction has been more complex. While the United States maintains a watchful eye on Sahelian affairs, it has largely stayed in the background of Burkina Faso's recent shift. American officials have expressed support for any effort that promotes regional security and democracy, but stopped short of direct endorsements. Why the caution? The answer lies in the geopolitical tension between sovereignty and influence. Burkina Faso's trajectory, alongside that of Mali and Niger, signals a growing resistance to traditional Western models of security cooperation. Instead of dependency, these nations are opting for autonomy. They are rejecting military bases and foreign dictates. They are building regional alliances that may include Russia, Turkey, or China, not necessarily out of loyalty, but out of necessity. This, understandably, unsettles those who long dictated terms in the region. Meanwhile, the African Union and ECOWAS have maintained a careful stance. Both organizations have been reluctant to fully endorse military-led governments, given their mandates to promote democracy. But even within these bodies, voices are emerging in favor of a security-first approach, arguing that without territorial control, no political framework can survive. A recent summit in Niamey hinted at this shift, with delegates from several Sahel countries praising Burkina Faso's results and urging a rethink of the region's dependence on external intervention. Mali and Niger, themselves recent breakaways from French partnerships, have quietly expressed interest in replicating the Burkina Faso blueprint. International media coverage has been predictably fragmented. Some Western outlets emphasize potential risks, accusing Traore's government of authoritarian leanings. Others, particularly Pan-African platforms, have celebrated the victory as a turning point for African self-determination. And that's precisely the fault line. For decades, Africa has been viewed as a subject in global affairs, spoken for, acted upon, policed from outside. But now the message from Ouagadougou is different. We will fight for ourselves, by ourselves, and we will win. This declaration is more than rhetoric. It is a challenge to the global order. And the world watching from afar is left to ask, what happens when Africa no longer asks for permission? And with this shift, a new kind of independence is being forged. But at what cost? The battle may have been won, but the war, both literal and symbolic, is far from over. As Burkina Faso celebrates this critical breakthrough, the road ahead remains littered with uncertainty, danger, and critical choices. At present, 28% of the country remains under some form of insurgent influence. While these areas are shrinking, they are also adapting. Intelligence reports suggest that terrorist cells are decentralizing, retreating into harder-to-access forested regions, and targeting civilian infrastructure with renewed desperation. In short, they may be losing ground, but not resolve. This poses a crucial question for Burkina Faso's leadership. What comes next? There are several paths before the nation. 1. It could continue its current momentum, sweeping through the remaining pockets of resistance with aggressive military strategy. 2. It could shift to a defensive posture, securing reclaimed areas, consolidating gains, and focusing on rebuilding before pursuing new offensives. 3. It could attempt both, maintaining pressure on insurgents while launching massive civic restoration initiatives to win hearts and minds. Most experts argue that the third option, though difficult, is the only sustainable route. Victory must not only be territorial, it must be transformational. That means schools must stay open. Markets must not only reopen, but thrive. Farmers must not just return to their fields, but receive the tools and protection to feed the nation. And above all, communities must feel that this government, this army, this moment belongs to them. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso holds the pen to its own story. The challenge now is what to write next. But this isn't just a national challenge. It is a continental one. Across Africa, nations are watching. From the grasslands of Mali to the highlands of Ethiopia, from the lakes of Uganda to the deserts of Niger, a question echoes. Can Africa truly rise by its own hand? The victory in the East is now being studied in think tanks, debated in parliaments, and whispered in youth gatherings across the continent. It's a beacon, but also a burden, for with success comes expectation. Captain Traore, in a recent radio broadcast, framed it this way: "We are not only fighting for Burkina Faso, we are fighting to prove that the blood of our ancestors was not shed for nothing." That message has found resonance, especially among the continent's older generation, those who remember colonial flags being lowered only to see new forms of control rise in their place. To them, this moment feels familiar. But it also feels different, because this time, the fight isn't to be acknowledged by the West, it's to be unshackled from its framework entirely. For the rising generation, the struggle is not to mimic European democracy or American capitalism. It is to define what African freedom looks like, on African terms, and that's where the deeper battle lies. Burkina Faso's current path is not without risk. The temptation of power, the danger of overreach, the threat of retaliation all loom. But the courage to claim sovereignty, to build from within, and to unite across divisions offers something rare: hope. Hope that this won't be just a moment, but a movement. Hope that when we say Africa rising, We're not just repeating a slogan, but proclaiming a destiny. So what comes next, after the guns quiet and the flags rise again? Banko jongi voy noi dungkwa, Task 5. Gonjuang fiatruok en luachongkwa, chopi naikong. Toise chi tiep tuk kiban saknan. Burkina Faso's recent military success has done more than shift borders. It has shaken assumptions. Assumptions that Africa must always lean, always borrow, always ask. For decades, that was the script. But today, a different story is being told. Not in boardrooms, but in the fields of Compiègne, the schools of Tapoa, and the voices of villagers who no longer whisper in fear. What we are witnessing is not merely a resurgence of state control. It is the slow but certain resurrection of dignity. The ability to walk your land, speak your tongue, raise your children, and plant your future without the permission of foreign powers. That is sovereignty in its purest form. And at the heart of this new chapter stands a young leader who refused to bow. Ibrahim Traore did not inherit calm. He walked into crisis. Yet with each day, with each reclaimed village, he is proving that leadership is not about lineage or legacy, but about service and sacrifice. Under his command, Burkina Faso has transformed from a state under siege into a symbol of African self-determination. But let us be clear, this is not the end of the struggle. It is perhaps the most dangerous part. For once, the world sees that Africa can rise without aid, without oversight, without being told how. Resistance will grow louder. Narratives will be challenged. Threats will take new forms. That is why we must stay awake. Not just Burkina Faso, but all of us. From the cities of Lagos to the hills of Lesotho. From the plains of Kenya to the coast of Ghana. This moment belongs to us. We must protect it. We must nurture it. We must remember that Africa Rising is not an event. It is a duty, a promise to those who came before, a responsibility to those yet to come. If this moment touched your spirit, don't let it pass in silence. Like, share, and speak your truth. Subscribe, because our grandparents dreamed of this day, and now we must live it out loud. Say it in the comments. New Africa. Say it again. Africa Rise. Say it with pride. Ibrahim Traore. Ibrahim Traore. Africa Rising.